truly makes a leader effective? I mean, really effective. Is it just brute strength or maybe cunning deception? Or is it something else entirely, something maybe a little more, well, controversial, that perhaps history has preferred to sweep under the rug? We've all seen leaders rise and fall, right? And many of us have probably wondered what secret ingredient lets some seize power and actually hold on to it, often against incredible odds while others just crumble. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're peeling back the layers of one of history's most fascinating and, let's be honest, often really misunderstood texts, Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. Our mission today is to unpack the core ideas, the surprising, sometimes genuinely shocking advice, and the enduring legacy of this incredibly influential work. And we're doing this based on all the rich material we've gathered for you. We're going to explore how these, well, ancient 16th century principles might still apply in really unexpected ways, even in today's complex world, and what they force us to confront about the true nature of power.
That's absolutely right. And while the context for the Prince was very specifically 16th century Italy, I mean, you have to picture this chaotic landscape of warring city-states, constantly shifting alliances, just perpetual political upheaval. Machiavelli's observations on, well, human nature and the dynamics of power, they feel strikingly timeless. He was writing from a place of intense personal and political turmoil. He'd been exiled from Florence, tortured even, and he was really trying to understand what actually works in the real politic of power. And by real politic, we mean the practical, often pretty cynical pursuit of political gain, sort of unburdened by conventional morality or, idealistic philosophy. This practical, sometimes downright brutal approach is precisely why his work remains so relevant. It forces us, whether we like it or not, to confront some really uncomfortable truths about leadership that just seem to transcend specific eras and cultures.
Okay, so let's unpack this foundational concept Machiavelli lays out right from the get-go. His distinction between different types of states and the unique challenges of actually ruling each one. It's clearly not just a one-size-fits-all playbook he's offering. He breaks it down quite pragmatically, doesn't he?
Indeed he does. Machiavelli basically identifies two main categories: the old hereditary states and the new ones. Now, old hereditary states, think monarchies passed down through generations, are surprisingly relatively easy to govern once you've managed to take them. The population, by and large, is already used to the ruling family, their traditions, So any disruption to that established order is often met with a kind of inherent suspicion. The real difficulty, then, isn't so much holding on to these states, it's the initial, often violent act of seizing control in the first place. And Machiavelli suggests, quite chillingly, that such a state can be effectively taken and held by utterly destroying the entire previous royal family.
Oh, okay, that's blunt.
It is. And he uses Alexander the Great's conquest of Darius III's Persian Empire as a prime example. The Persian Empire, see, it was structured more like a collection of provinces or satrapies, united under the central monarch, but it didn't necessarily have those deep familial roots in every single part of the realm that might inspire, popular resistance everywhere. So when Alexander conquered it, he eliminated the ruling line completely. And by doing that, he removed the only real alternative center of loyalty that people could rally around. There was no legitimate heir left, no established dynasty to inspire a counter-revolution. And as a result, Alexander was able to hold on to that massive empire securely. It's a stark, almost brutal logic. Eliminate the source of future opposition, do it completely, and do it immediately.
Right. So, okay, if you're not lucky enough to be born into power, if you're, say, an ambitious individual looking to carve out a new state, how do you even get there, according to Machiavelli? Because that sounds like a massive undertaking.
It definitely is. And Machiavelli outlines essentially a two-step process for someone ambitious enough to try and rise to become a prince. First, he really emphasizes that they must closely follow the examples of great historical figures who seized opportunities. He often points to people like Moses, Cyrus the Great, Theseus, Romulus. These weren't men born to rule established kingdoms, right? They were individuals who recognized the right moment, possessed this extraordinary quality he calls virtù ferni, which is a tricky concept. It's kind of a blend of skill, cunning, ambition, raw prowess, maybe even ruthlessness, and they acted with decisive force to create their own domains.
Yeah.
They didn't wait for opportunities, they basically made them.
And the second step.
The second step, and this is absolutely crucial for Machiavelli, is that the aspiring prince must be well-armed. Now, this isn't just about having soldiers lying around. It's about having your own armed forces loyal only to you, not mercenaries, not the troops borrowed from other states. For Machiavelli, that self-reliance, the independent capacity to project force, is the absolute bedrock of sustainable power. It's the ultimate guarantee of security. It's a principle we'll definitely dive into more because without your own arms, he basically argues you are completely at the mercy of other people's whims and shifting allegiances. You have no real control.
Okay, so let's say you've managed it. You've acquired a new state, perhaps through these pretty formidable means. What's the immediate playbook for securing it? Because it sounds like you've just kicked a hornet's nest and now you're probably surrounded by potential enemies.
You've got it exactly. That initial phase, right after acquisition, is indeed brutal. But Machiavelli insists it must be quick and absolutely decisive. He advises that, and I'm quoting loosely here, any resistance must be destroyed by using cruel, quick, and firm methods. This is about delivering a single, overwhelming blow to neutralize all potential opposition immediately, to eliminate threats before they can even properly form or gather support. The idea is to crush any lingering hope of rebellion, any attachment to the old regime, and instill immediate, absolute fear, get all the necessary nastiness done at once.
All at once, so no gradual crackdown.
No, exactly. And this is a really critical nuance in his thinking. This initial sharp brutality should be immediately followed by a strategy of gradually granting benefits to the people. The idea is to inflict all the necessary pain in one go. This is what he controversially calls cruelty well used, or good cruelty, and then slowly introduce positive changes, improvements, maybe lower taxes, whatever it is. This gives the populace something to look forward to, something to perhaps even be grateful for, rather than leaving them living under constant fear of more oppression to come. The shock of the initial cruelty settles, and then the benefits start trickling down, leading people to maybe think, okay, things are actually getting better under this new ruler. It's a chillingly practical blueprint for inflicting necessary pain in a way that minimizes long-term blowback. It's about brutal efficiency.
It does sound incredibly harsh, but also, yeah, incredibly calculated, almost like a form of psychological warfare. So what's the long-term strategy then? For sustained security, once the initial takeover is done and you've started this process of gradually granting benefits, it can't just be about military strength forever, can it?
No, not entirely. The military strength remains foundational. For sustained security, Machiavelli argues a prince must work tirelessly to win the people's favor, or at least avoid their hatred, and dispel any lingering hostility. This means things like ensuring justice, preventing corrupt officials from exploiting them, maybe fostering some sense of shared purpose or security. However, let's be absolutely clear. Machiavelli is unequivocal that the ultimate, undeniable safety for a prince comes only when he can raise and maintain his own army for defense. This is non-negotiable for him, and he emphasizes that key distinction again. Relying on mercenaries or the armies of other states is fundamentally unreliable. You just cannot depend on them for true, long-term security.
Why so down on mercenaries? Weren't they common back then?
Oh, incredibly common, yes. But Machiavelli saw them as utterly disloyal, motivated purely by money. They'll fight when it's easy, but they'll abandon you or even turn on you when the stakes get high or a better offer comes along. Foreign armies, auxiliary troops, are almost worse in his view. They might help you win, but they have allegiance to their own leaders, not to you. They become an occupying force, a dangerous threat within your own state. He points to figures like Hiero of Syracuse, an ancient Greek tyrant. Hiero initially used mercenaries, realized how dangerous they were, and then took the decisive step of killing them all off and replacing them with his own citizen soldiers. Hiero understood that relying on others' arms was a path to ruin, and his brutal action cemented his power. For Machiavelli, a prince's real strength is directly proportional to his capacity for independent military action, period.
Okay, so military might is the cornerstone, but what about the prince himself? His personal qualities, his preparation? Does he need to be some kind of paragon of virtue, a shining example of moral rectitude, or something else entirely? Because you hinted earlier at this sort of paradox of virtue.
Yeah, far from needing to be a paragon. Machiavelli's advice for a prince's personal development is intensely pragmatic, bordering on cynical, really. A prince absolutely must diligently read history, he must meticulously study the art of war, and he needs to know his own land intimately, its geography, its people, its resources, its weak points. This knowledge provides both strategic foresight and a practical understanding of his domain. But then comes this paradox of virtue. A prince must absolutely appear to be good. He needs to reject an image of piety, integrity, mercy, faithfulness to the public. This is crucial for maintaining popular support, or at least acceptance. However, and this is the kicker, he must also, crucially, know how to be bad when necessity demands it. And not just know how, but be willing to act on that knowledge without hesitation or moral scruple getting in the way.
So actually being virtuous can be a problem.
Exactly. This isn't just about appearances. Machiavelli radically argues that actual adherence to traditional virtues like generosity, or even keeping your word when it's inconvenient, can be a prince's undoing. That was a truly revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable idea for his time, and frankly, still is for many people today. Take generosity, for instance. He argues that being truly generous, spending freely, quickly depletes a prince's resources. This forces him to either stop being generous, looking fickle, or raise taxes heavily, which inevitably makes him hated by the people. So seeming generous is good, actually being generous is dangerous. And when it comes to that famous dilemma, fear versus love, Machiavelli gives us an initial glimpse into his most famous idea right here. He argues that fear, unlike love, is controllable. Love is this fickle emotion, right? A bond easily broken for personal gain, withdrawn at any moment. But the dread of punishment, that's a constant, reliable motivator. So a prince shouldn't be afraid of being considered cruel if he keeps order. He should be willing to use cunning, deception, break his word if needed, operate outside conventional morality if the situation, the necessity of the state, demands it. The ultimate goal, Machiavelli advises, is simple. Try to be loved if possible, sure. But at a minimum, you absolutely must not be hated to remain safe. Hatred for him is the true political poison. It's more dangerous than any invading army because it breeds conspiracy from within.
Okay, this raises a really important practical question then. Once you've conquered a new state, especially if its people, language, customs are totally different from your own place, you're basically ruling a foreign land, a potentially unstable new territory. How do you actually keep it? How do you manage that inherent instability?
This is where Machiavelli puts a really strong, almost surprising emphasis on the ruler's physical presence. He makes a very compelling argument that one of the most effective, maybe the most effective, options for maintaining control over these difficult new states is for the prince himself to actually go and establish residence there. He gives this incredibly vivid example. Mehmed the Conqueror, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. What did Mehmed do? He almost immediately moved his capital from Adrianople to the newly conquered city, Constantinople. Machiavelli saw this not just as symbolic, but as a strategic masterstroke that made Mehmed's position incredibly durable and secure.
Why was living there so crucial?
Well, think about it. By living there, Mehmed could address problems quickly and efficiently as they arose, nipping them in the bud before they could escalate into full-blown rebellions. He could keep a close eye on local officials, preventing them from exploiting the territory and breeding resentment among the populace. His presence kept his subjects close, which, Machiavelli notes, gave those inclined to loyalty more reason to show it, and those inclined towards mischief more reason to fear him. Plus, it acted as a powerful deterrent to invaders. Who would want to attack a state where the prince himself resided, knowing they'd face the full, immediate weight of his attention and resources? In Machiavelli's eyes, if Mehmed hadn't moved there, if he tried to rule Constantinople from afar, he likely wouldn't have been able to hold on to it at all, regardless of his military strength. Presence was paramount.
Okay, so that makes sense for the 16th century. But what does this mean for leaders today? I mean, we can't always be physically present everywhere, can we? Especially leaders with national or even international responsibilities spanning vast distances. Is this advice still applicable in our globalized, often remote work world where presence is frequently virtual?
I think it absolutely is, though the form of presence has evolved. While literal physical presence isn't always feasible for, say, a president or a global CEO, the principle translates. Being present today means being deeply involved and supremely informed.
It's about engagement. Think about some top CEOs, right? They're famous for being constantly connected up early, sending emails, working late, responding to questions quickly, offering observations across different teams and time zones. They are connected, they are aware, they are engaged, even if they're not physically sitting in every single office every day. The core principle is about hands-on management, having your finger on the pulse of the organization or the state, knowing what's really going on.
And the danger of not being present. Machiavelli's warning here is stark, and I think it resonates powerfully today. Failure to be engaged, he suggests, essentially conjures fate. You invite disaster through neglect. Procrastination, letting things slide because you're not there to see them firsthand, is incredibly dangerous. As he put it, if one is on the spot, disorders are seen as they arise, and one can quickly deal with them. But if one is not at hand, one hears of them only when they have become serious, and by then it is too late. This really underscores a vital point for any leader. You have to prioritize managing the here and now. Grand visions for tomorrow are useless if you can't handle today's challenges effectively and immediately. Machiavelli really urges leaders to focus on the present reality. He famously states, "How one lives is so far removed from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation." In essence, deal with the world as it is, not as you wish it were, because inaction or delusion in the present is a guaranteed path to failure later on.
Speaking of mistakes and neglecting realities, Machiavelli had some pretty sharp words for Louis XII of France regarding his ventures into Italy. What went wrong there, in Machiavelli's view? It seems like a classic cautionary tale based on what you've been saying.
Oh, absolutely. Louis XII serves as a prime example of how not to do things, according to Machiavelli. He made several critical errors, and they really illustrate these enduring pitfalls for any leader. First, exactly as we just discussed, he failed the presence test. He did not reside in the Italian territories he conquered, which meant he couldn't address problems quickly, couldn't build local relationships, couldn't really understand the evolving situation on the ground. This absence created a power vacuum and allowed discontent to just fester.
Okay, so lack of presence was one thing. What else?
His biggest mistake, arguably, and one that highlights a foundational principle for Machiavelli, was actively strengthening others at his own expense. Louis initially entered Italy with the help of the Venetians and gained the friendship of many smaller surrounding states when he conquered Lombardy. This was his moment of strength. But instead of consolidating these relationships, maybe building alliances with these smaller, potentially loyal states who depended on him for protection, Louis made what Machiavelli saw as a catastrophic decision. He allied himself with the far more powerful Pope Alexander VI, helping the Pope's son, the infamous Caesar Borgia, carve out territory in the Romagna region. This significantly empowered the church, which is already a major political force in Italy.
And that backfired.
Massively. The empowered church, particularly through Caesar Borgia's ruthless campaigns, later turned directly against Louis and became a major obstacle to French ambitions in Italy. Machiavelli's core principle derived from this whole episode is chillingly clear, and it's one of his most quoted lines. Whoever is responsible for another's becoming powerful ruins himself. Power, for Machiavelli, is basically a finite resource. If you make someone else stronger, you inherently weaken your own position relative to them. Louis XII, by bringing a rival power like the papacy into greater prominence within Italy, made himself vulnerable. Many people in Milan, already discontented with French rule, partly because Louis wasn't present, were easily drawn to the Pope, especially since Louis hadn't established French colonies or strong local ties. He simply couldn't manage these emerging problems from afar, and the result was the swift loss of all his Italian territories. It just perfectly highlights Machiavelli's cynical realism. Conflict is inevitable. Power acquisition is often a zero-sum game. You can't secure your position by appeasing or empowering potential rivals. You merely set the stage for her own eventual undoing.
It really sounds like Machiavelli is shouting from the rooftops, don't be wishy-washy. Does that strong stance apply to staying neutral in conflicts too? Is neutrality always a bad idea in his book, or is there ever a time and place for it?
Oh, he absolutely despised neutrality. He saw it not as prudence, but as a destructive vice, a sign of indecision in a leader. His argument is forceful. A prince gains the most respect when he clearly declares himself either a true friend or a downright enemy. Taking a side, any side, he argues, is always more advantageous than remaining neutral, even if the outcome of the conflict is uncertain.
Why is neutrality so bad?
Well, look at the pitfalls he outlines. They're pretty severe. If the side you might have supported wins, they likely resent you for not helping them in their time of need. They won't feel indebted to you, maybe even see you as unreliable. Think about Louis XII and Pope Alexander VI. Again, Louis helped the Pope, but didn't commit fully and gained no lasting loyalty. Conversely, if the side you might have supported loses, they'll probably despise you for abandoning them when they needed aid. So either way, you lose potential goodwill. More than that, both sides will ultimately see the neutral prince as timid, indecisive, fundamentally weak, and not someone to be feared or relied upon. You become an easy target, isolated with no true allies when trouble comes knocking on your door. Machiavelli put it very succinctly. Princes who are undecided usually follow the path of neutrality to escape immediate danger, and they usually come to grief. For him, action taking a clear stance is almost always better than inaction, even if that action leads to eventual defeat. At least taking a firm stance earns a certain kind of respect, even from your enemies, because it demonstrates strength of character, decisiveness, virtue.
So never delay a decision.
Well, the only time he suggests delaying a decision is if that delay itself provides a clear, calculated strategic advantage. Maybe it allows you to gather more strength or wait for your rivals to weaken each other. Otherwise, hesitation just signals indecision. And that, in his view, inevitably leads to finding yourself friendless and vulnerable, completely at the mercy of events rather than shaping them.
Okay, but hang on. Is it always bad to be neutral? I can imagine listeners thinking, what about Switzerland? Or, other historical figures who seem to have succeeded precisely because they stayed out of major conflicts. What about the scenarios where calculated detachment actually seemed like the wiser path?
That is a crucial counterexample, and it really does raise a fascinating question about the potential limits of Machiavelli's perhaps overly rigid judgment here. World War II is a perfect case study. You had Benito Mussolini in Italy, who, interestingly, was a fervent student of Machiavelli and certainly embodied many of his principles, like decisiveness and embracing power. Mussolini allied decisively with Hitler, took a side, and ultimately lost everything, leading to his own ignominious death. Then you have Francisco Franco in Spain. Franco, despite his ideological leanings, adopted an official policy of neutrality throughout the war. He skillfully played both sides, resisted pressure from Hitler, and ultimately survived the war, continuing to rule Spain for 3 more decades. So what does that tell us? Well, it makes us wonder, doesn't it? Is there a critical difference between neutrality born of cowardice or indecision, which is what Machiavelli rightly condemns, and neutrality born of shrewd prudence and careful strategic discretion, where a leader accurately assesses their position, understands the risks, and makes a calculated choice to hold back? Perhaps Machiavelli, in his relentless emphasis on bold action and taking sides, slightly overlooked the value of this kind of calculated detachment in certain very specific situations, especially when the potential costs of involvement are catastrophic or your own position is inherently vulnerable. It highlights that even for a thinker as astute and pragmatic as Machiavelli, context matters immensely. An assessment of your own strength in the specific circumstances, what he called fortuna or luck fortune, is critical. What looks like a universal truth, never be neutral, might actually have some powerful exceptions based on pragmatic calculation, not just fear.
That makes sense. So, okay, regardless of the immediate outcome of a conflict, win or lose, neutral or involved, what does Machiavelli say about maintaining alliances after the dust has settled? Because it seems like the game of power, in his view, never really stops. Relationships must constantly be managed, right?
You're absolutely right. The game is continuous, and relationships are always dynamic. Machiavelli does consider the aftermath. He observes, quite pragmatically, that if your chosen ally wins, they will likely feel grateful and indebted to you for your support. This could potentially translate into future favors, continued security, or a stronger alliance moving forward. If, however, your chosen ally loses, the situation is obviously trickier, but not necessarily disastrous for the relationship. He suggests they may still offer you protection in your shared adversity, and the bond of friendship, having been tested through common hardship, might even strengthen. What's really fascinating here is that despite his generally quite cynical view of human nature, Machiavelli does observe that men carry enough honor and gratitude, his words, not to immediately turn on their allies in these post-conflict scenarios. It's one of the few places where he seems to grant a little bit more credit to human loyalty, although even here it's probably framed in a very pragmatic, self-interested way. It's not about deep moral bonds, but more likely a recognition of shared history and potential future mutual benefit. You don't gratuitously betray someone who just fought alongside you, because that makes you look unreliable to future potential allies.
But didn't you say earlier that Machiavelli warns against empowering your allies too much? Why is that? Isn't having a strong ally usually a good thing? It seems a bit counterintuitive at first glance.
It does seem counterintuitive, but it ties directly back to the errors of Louis XII and is absolutely a core Machiavellian principle. Remember that quote: "The one who causes another to become powerful is ruined." Why? Because, as Machiavelli explains, that predominance has been brought about either by skill or by force, and both your skill and your force are distrusted by him who has been raised to power. Essentially, Machiavelli views power as a scarce, finite resource. When you actively help someone else become powerful, especially if they become significantly more powerful because of your help, you inherently diminish your own relative strength and influence within that power dynamic. You've created a potential rival who now owes their strength partly to you, making them potentially resentful or suspicious of your motives, or simply ambitious enough to challenge you now that they can. So princes should absolutely establish alliances for mutual benefit, yes, but they must be extremely careful not to make their allies too powerful, especially if that power comes directly from their patronage. The grim reality, for Machiavelli, is that those you empower can, and often will, turn against you once they are strong enough and no longer need your support, or simply when their interests inevitably diverge from yours. He sees political life as this constant state of potential conflict where power is always, at some fundamental level, a zero-sum game. Trying to avoid conflict by appeasing or strengthening another power isn't smart strategy in his view. It's a fundamental mistake that will likely lead to your own downfall later on.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit unsettling for some. Machiavelli tells us that a prince must embody not just the man, but also the beast. What on earth is that all about? It sounds like he's encouraging something, I don't know, primal, something almost savage.
He absolutely is encouraging something primal, and it's one of his most striking metaphors. He introduces this concept with a powerful reference from mythology. Chiron, the centaur half-man, half-beast, who was famous in Greek myth as the tutor of great heroes like Achilles and Hercules. Chiron, depicted as the wisest and most just of the centaurs, taught these heroes not only human arts like music and medicine, but also the skills needed for survival and conquest, skills that drew on both rational thought and, well, primal will. Machiavelli uses this Chiron metaphor brilliantly to illustrate that a prince must possess and utilize dual natures to rule effectively. The man represents the realm of law, reason, logic, solving disputes through discussion, adhering to agreements, acting in a civilized manner. This, Machiavelli says, is natural to man. It's how humans ideally should conduct themselves. However, and this is the crucial Machiavellian twist, because the first method, law and reason, is often insufficient, meaning reason and civilized norms often fail to achieve the necessary outcomes in the messy, brutal world of politics. It is essential to resort to the second, which is the beast. The beast represents intimidation, raw force, the willingness to act outside the bounds of law when necessity dictates. His stark conclusion: it is necessary that a prince understand how to avail himself of the beast in the man. A prince who relies solely on one nature without the other is simply not built to last. Sometimes when diplomacy fails, when treaties are broken, when existential threats emerge, a show of overwhelming, even beast-like strength is absolutely required.
So, when a prince needs to channel this inner beast, what kind of beast are we actually talking about? Does Machiavelli suggest specific animal instincts for a prince to master, or is it just a general idea of being, tough and ruthless when needed?
No, he's actually quite specific, and this is where his insights get particularly sharp and practical. When a prince is forced to tap into that beast nature, Machiavelli advises him to learn from and mimic two crucial animals: the lion and the fox. The lion obviously represents strength, courage, and power. Its sheer force, its formidable reputation, its willingness to fight ferociously can often keep adversaries and even its own potentially rebellious subjects at bay, sometimes without even needing to engage in a direct confrontation. A lion's presence alone commands immediate respect and, crucially, fear. It deters opposition simply by demonstrating its known capacity for violence.
Okay, strength makes sense. What about the fox?
The fox is just as important, maybe even more so in certain situations. The fox represents cunning, shrewdness, and the ability to recognize deception. The lion, Machiavelli points out, is powerful, but not particularly clever. It can easily fall into traps or be outwitted. The fox, on the other hand, is adept at detecting deceptions, anticipating plots, navigating complex situations, and escaping snares laid by enemies. This foxy intelligence is especially vital in diplomacy, in managing rivals, in uncovering conspiracies, and navigating those treacherous political landscapes where hidden agendas and subtle manipulations can undermine a prince's position far more effectively than open warfare. The interdependence of the two is absolutely key, as Machiavelli puts it. A prince, therefore, who is forced to behave like a beast, should learn from the fox and the lion, for the lion cannot defend himself from snares, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. The lion protects against overt threats, brute force, direct attacks. The fox protects against the subtle, insidious threats, deception, conspiracy, traps. You need both. It's this ruthless, pragmatic blend of overt power and covert intelligence that makes a prince truly formidable.
That sounds like a masterclass in adaptability, really, almost like a blueprint for modern strategic thinking in business or politics. How does a leader actually blend these two, the lion and the fox, in practice? How do you use both without just becoming a brute, a bully, or conversely, a constantly scheming, untrustworthy trickster?
It's precisely about that dynamic adaptability and, critically, knowing exactly when to apply which approach. Machiavelli argues that to gain power, and more importantly, to prosper and hold on to it, a leader needs a seamless combination of both cunning and force. When civilized debate fails, when rational arguments aren't getting you anywhere, when persuasion isn't working, then maybe a show of strength, what some might bluntly call twisting the arm, becomes necessary. This could manifest as a strong public declaration, a decisive policy move, a strategic military maneuver, or simply a demonstration of unwavering lion-like resolve. However, and this is crucial, he cautions against excessive unrestrained force. Using the lion too much or inappropriately just makes you a bully. And being seen as a bully ultimately incites hatred, which, as we'll discuss more, is the one thing a prince absolutely must avoid at all costs because it leads to ruin. So the true art lies in blending your power, the lion, with your cunning, the fox, cultivating both skill sets and deploying whichever is most appropriate for the specific challenge at hand. This combined capability overcomes the individual weaknesses inherent in relying solely on either strength or cunning. For Machiavelli, a leader must be cautious and shrewd when prudence is needed, sensing traps and deceptions like a fox, while simultaneously being brave and forceful like a lion when courage and decisive action are required. He doesn't advocate for blind adherence to any single ideology or absolute moral standard. Context is everything. The leader must always be ready, always adaptable, always willing to change tactics based on the situation to ensure the primary goal, the preservation and security of the state.
Okay, this inevitably brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of The Prince, the advice or maybe observation on using wicked or outright criminal means to gain power. Does Machiavelli actually endorse this in a moral sense, or is he just, coolly observing what happens in the brutal realities of the political world?
That's an excellent and very important distinction to make. And the answer is pretty clear. He neither praises nor condemns such methods from a purely moral standpoint. He simply states with a kind of brutal impartiality that they work for acquiring power and sometimes for maintaining it. His entire focus in The Prince is on effectiveness, on efficacy, not on traditional ethics or religious morality. He's analyzing power like a scientist might analyze a natural phenomenon. He gives two really infamous case studies to illustrate this amoral pragmatic calculus. First, there's Agathocles of Syracuse. This guy rose from incredibly humble beginnings, supposedly the son of a potter, to become the ruler, the prince of Syracuse, through what Machiavelli himself describes as a shocking combination of wickedness, determination, and ability. After rising through the military ranks, Agathocles convened what was supposed to be a crucial meeting of the Syracusan Senate, gathering all the senators and the wealthiest, most influential citizens in one place. Once they were all assembled, unsuspecting, he gave a secret signal to his loyal soldiers, who then burst in and systematically executed every single one of them.
Just like that.
It's like that, a calculated massacre. This single act of extreme cunning and utter ruthlessness allowed Agathocles to seize absolute control of the state without any immediate serious internal threat. Now, Machiavelli's assessment of Agathocles is really telling. He acknowledges Agathocles' courage, his skill, his virtue in gaining power were laudable in a purely practical sense, but he also notes his methods lacked virtue and true honor. Agathocles achieved power, yes, but not glory in the classical sense. So he doesn't earn Machiavelli's full admiration. Why? Because his actions seemed primarily driven by personal ambition, not necessarily the long-term good of the state itself, even if the state benefited later.
And the second example?
The second example is Oliverado da Fermo, a figure much closer to Machiavelli's own time, making the example perhaps even more chilling for his original readers. Oliverado orchestrated a very similar massacre. He invited many local nobles, including his own uncle Giovanni Fogliani, who had raised him, to a grand banquet, supposedly to celebrate his return and achievements, feigning reconciliation and friendship. Then, at a prearranged moment during the feast, he had his loyal soldiers emerge from hiding places and kill all the guests. Brutal. He then immediately rode through the town, terrorizing the populace, cornered the magistrates, and scared them into forming a new government entirely under his rule. He cemented his power through sheer terror.
Okay, so two examples of seizing power through massacre. How does Machiavelli analyze these?
This is where he introduces that absolutely critical, though morally problematic distinction. The difference between cruelty well used, or good cruelty, and cruelty abused, or bad cruelty. He applies this purely practical, not ethical judgment to these morally reprehensible acts. Good cruelty, in his framework, is cruelty that is inflicted once for all, decisively, quickly, and concentrated at the very beginning of acquiring power. It addresses specific necessities for securing the state, and crucially, it then stops. No more major crimes or ongoing acts of terror are needed after that initial necessary brutality. This allows the people's minds to eventually rest, allows fear to subside somewhat, and makes it possible for the prince to then win them over, or at least pacify them, through the gradual granting of benefits we talked about earlier. Agathocles' cruelty, Machiavelli suggests, could be seen as well used, because after the initial massacre he stopped, established order, secured the state, and even successfully defended it against invaders with popular support. For Machiavelli, in this specific pragmatic calculation, the ends justified the means, because the ultimate goal achieved was the state's welfare and long-term stability, not just perpetual personal enrichment through terror. Bad cruelty, on the other hand, is cruelty that isn't decisive or concentrated. It either starts small and grows over time, or it becomes a continuous, messy affair, requiring repeated criminal behavior to maintain control. This keeps the population in a constant state of fear and anxiety, making it impossible for them to ever feel secure or develop any genuine support for the prince. Alvarado's cruelty was ultimately bad or abused because it continued. His rule was perpetually characterized by terror, suspicion, and a fundamental lack of broad public support, which eventually contributed to his downfall. He was himself tricked and killed by Cesare Borgia not long after. His goal seemed to be pure self-aggrandizement through fear, not the stable welfare of the state. And that distinction from Machiavelli is absolutely key. The true prince, even when cruel, acts for the perceived necessity of the state, not solely for himself.
So, the chilling principle seems to be commit all your necessary cruelties at once. Inflict the maximum required pain immediately, decisively, get it over with, and then stop. Can you give us maybe some other historical examples, perhaps beyond the 16th century, where you can see this ruthless Machiavellian logic seemingly playing out in the consolidation of power?
Absolutely. This cold, hard logic unfortunately resonates throughout history, demonstrating its enduring, if deeply uncomfortable, practicality in certain situations. Think about the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, didn't just depose Tsar Nicholas II, they systematically executed him and his entire immediate family, his wife, his young son, his daughters, everyone. Why? Machiavelli would argue this brutally efficient act eliminated the single greatest threat to their new power, the symbol of the old regime, and, crucially, prevented any possibility of future revenge or rallying around a surviving Romanov heir. Had they left even one member of the core royal family alive, that person could have become a figurehead for counter-revolutionaries, a living symbol of legitimate opposition. By making the injury so total, so complete, they removed the capacity for that kind of symbolic retaliation.
That's incredibly dark. Another example.
Another powerful, though different example comes from the Chinese Civil War, particularly the aftermath of the Long March in 1934-35. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek had the smaller communist Red Army on the absolute back foot, forcing them into that brutal year-long retreat across thousands of miles. Mao Zedong, who consolidated his leadership during this desperate retreat, used the subsequent decade not just to rebuild his forces, but arguably to plot his ultimate revenge and plan for the complete elimination of his rivals. When the Communist Revolution finally succeeded in 1949, Mao and his army didn't simply defeat the nationalists militarily. They drove them off the mainland entirely, forcing them to retreat to Taiwan. There was no compromise offered, no power sharing. It was total victory, complete elimination of the rival power center on the mainland. Machiavelli's famous quote perfectly encapsulates this ruthless logic. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, but of more serious ones they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. It's fundamentally about removing the capacity for future retaliation, either by treating people well enough that they have no desire for revenge, or by injuring them so severely that they have no ability to seek it. It's a terrifyingly binary choice.
It really is a ruthless piece of advice, utterly devoid of sentiment or conventional morality. I can imagine many listeners finding that incredibly hard to stomach, thinking, surely there must be another way. Does Machiavelli himself acknowledge any counterpoints, any situations where this strategy of absolute destruction might not be the best course, even from a purely pragmatic, state-focused perspective, where maybe something less than total crushing could be more beneficial?
He doesn't explicitly offer systematic counterpoints within the Prince itself in that direct way, mainly because his primary aim in the book is to lay out what he observes works to gain and maintain power, however harsh. But we can certainly look at historical events through a kind of Machiavellian lens and see where his sometimes binary thinking might fall short or a different kind of pragmatism might actually prevail. A classic example from ancient history that serves as a fascinating counterpoint is the Mytilenean debate, which took place in Athens during the Peloponnesian War back in 427 BC. The city-state of Mytilene, which was an ally or subject state of Athens, had rebelled. After a difficult siege, Athens forced Mytilene to surrender unconditionally. The Athenian assembly then debated fiercely about how to deal with them.
And what were the arguments?
Well, one prominent figure, Cleon, a general known for his harshness, argued for what we could call a purely Machiavellian approach. Kill all the adult Mytilenean men immediately and enslave all the women and children. This would be a swift, decisive, terrifying punishment designed explicitly to deter any future rebellions from other cities within the Athenian Empire. Maximum fear, maximum crushing. However, another speaker named Diodotus argued passionately against Cleon's proposal. But importantly, Diodotus didn't argue primarily for mercy based on ethics or compassion. Instead, he made a pragmatic economic argument. He argued it was actually in Athens' self-interest to impose punishments, like installing a democracy they controlled and levying heavy financial penalties, essentially exploiting the city's resources, rather than simply destroying it. Total annihilation would mean losing a valuable source of tribute, manpower, and strategic location. His view, remarkably, prevailed. The Athenians sent a second ship to Mytilene just in time to countermand the execution order from the first ship. They imposed democracy and gained financially from the decision, keeping the city intact as a resource. This illustrates that sometimes a less brutal approach, one that combines punishment with practical benefits like long-term economic stability and resource extraction, can actually be more advantageous for the state than total destruction, even if it runs counter to Machiavelli's more general advice about crushing resistance completely. It suggests that complex realities like economic interdependence might sometimes introduce a different kind of pragmatism that outweighs the immediate shock and fear factor of annihilation.
That's a great counterpoint. So it really sounds like for Machiavelli, the bottom line is always results. Results above all else. Is it safe to say he's fundamentally less concerned with ethics or even intent and almost entirely focused on pure efficacy, the raw outcome of an action?
Yes, I think that's absolutely spot on. For Machiavelli, in the context of The Prince, success is generally approved of, almost regardless of the means used to achieve it, especially if that success leads to a stable and secure state. Failure, however, is almost always disapproved of, even if it results from seemingly good intentions or adherence to conventional morality. He believes it's perfectly natural and common for ambitious people to desire to acquire power and wealth, and he says they will actually be praised, not blamed, for doing so when they can, when they succeed. But he delivers a critical warning. When they cannot do so, when they lack the means or ability, yet wish to do so by any means pursuing goals beyond their capacity, then there is folly and blame. It's absolutely crucial in his view for a prince to realistically assess his own limitations, his resources, his virtue, and the circumstances. Fortuna. He must not pursue targets he cannot realistically achieve, because failure, regardless of how noble the intent might have seemed, will inevitably bring blame, contempt, and weaken his position. Efficacy is paramount. The end result, the preservation and strengthening of the state, is the ultimate, really the only, measure of a prince's actions in this political arena. The only good in this context is what demonstrably works for the state's survival and prosperity.
Okay, this leads us perfectly to arguably Machiavelli's most famous and certainly most often misunderstood statement. The question of whether it is better for a prince to be feared or loved, this really gets to the heart of so much debate about the prince, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This is probably the cornerstone of his entire philosophy on practical leadership, and it's where his cynical realism about human nature is laid bare most starkly. Machiavelli addresses this question directly and unflinchingly. The ideal situation, he readily admits, is for a prince to be both loved and feared simultaneously. That combination offers the most secure foundation for power. However, he immediately follows this by conceding the harsh reality. Since it's incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible, to consistently achieve both qualities in a single leader, and because human nature is, in his view, fundamentally flawed and self-interested, it is much safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both.
Safer to be feared? Why? What's his reasoning behind that stark conclusion?
His reasoning stems directly from that deeply, almost unsparingly, cynical view of human nature we keep coming back to. He asserts, quite famously, "For this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, voluble, meaning fickle or changeable, dissemblers, deceptive pretenders, cowardly avoiders of danger, covetous, greedy." Given this view, love, he argues, is a bond based merely on obligation or affection. It's a fickle connection, held together by gratitude, which, because men are inherently self-interested and ungrateful, is easily broken whenever their personal advantage dictates it. People will promise you their loyalty, offer you their blood, their property, their children, especially when danger seems distant and supporting you seems beneficial. But Machiavelli warns, when that danger actually approaches, or when their own self-interest shifts even slightly, they will quickly turn against you. Love is unreliable. Fear, on the other hand, is based on something far more dependable in his view, the dread of punishment which never forsakes you. Fear is a constant, reliable motivator for obedience and loyalty, precisely because the consequences of disloyalty are perceived as severe and certain. It's a commitment that people cannot easily escape or rationalize away based on changing circumstances, because the fear of pain or loss is a powerful, ever-present deterrent.
Can you give us some powerful examples, maybe ones Machiavelli himself used, to illustrate this principle in action, comparing leaders who lean more towards love versus those who lean towards fear and the consequences?
Certainly. Machiavelli provides a brilliant, direct contrast between two legendary military commanders from Roman history, Scipio Africanus, the Roman general famous for defeating Hannibal, and Hannibal himself, the Carthaginian general who terrified Rome for years. Scipio was widely loved and held in extremely high esteem, both by his troops and by the Roman people. He was renowned for his clemency, his mildness, his ability to inspire devotion. However, Machiavelli sharply criticizes him on one key point. He argues Scipio's leniency, his desire to be loved, led to overly loose discipline within his armies. This actually resulted in a significant mutiny among his troops while campaigning in Spain. Scipio, despite his immense popularity and personal virtue, was seemingly unwilling or unable to inflict the necessary harsh punishment required to bring his army decisively back under control. Machiavelli concludes, quite harshly, no prince should mind being called cruel for having kept his subjects peaceful and loyal. In his view, Scipio's excessive mercy, aimed at preserving love, ironically allowed disorder to flourish, which ultimately harmed the state's interests. Hannibal, conversely, is described by Machiavelli and other Roman historians as inhumanly cruel. He was known for his severity and ruthlessness. Yet Machiavelli argues this very trait, when combined with Hannibal's undeniable courage, strategic genius, and virtue, made him both venerated and terrifying in the eyes of his soldiers. Remember, Hannibal commanded a huge, incredibly diverse army composed of many different races and nationalities: Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, fighting far from home in hostile territory for over a decade. And yet, remarkably, there were virtually no internal dissensions or revolts recorded among his troops. Machiavelli attributes this astonishing discipline and loyalty directly to Hannibal's calculated use of cruelty. He argues that this fear, combined with respect for his ability, was an essential asset, enabling Hannibal to command unwavering obedience and maintain iron discipline in circumstances where love alone would have surely failed miserably. For Machiavelli, the lesson is clear. A popular leader might be admired, might be loved, but a truly effective leader, especially in difficult times, is often one who is respected, even feared, through the consistent, if sometimes severe, application of authority and punishment.
Wow, okay. Hearing that laid out, it really does sound like an open invitation for tyranny. It's so easy to read this and just conclude, okay, Machiavelli is just telling leaders to be ruthless dictators. Did he truly advocate for cruelty just for cruelty's sake? Or is there still a critical nuance here, a line he draws, that we might be missing if we just focus on the fear part?
This is where that critical nuance lies, and it's precisely why Machiavelli is so often misinterpreted, leading to that simplistic caricature of Machiavellian, meaning purely evil or treacherous. He does not advocate for wanton, arbitrary cruelty or tyranny for its own sake, or for the leader's personal gratification. His ultimate goal, the true measure he uses to judge a prince's actions, is always the preservation and well-being of the state, its stability, its security, its ability to function and endure. He views cruelty purely as a tool, a harsh medicine perhaps, and its justification depends entirely on its outcome in service of that primary goal, the health of the state. Think back to Cesare Borgia, the figure Machiavelli seemed to greatly admire as a model prince, despite Borgia's undeniable brutality. Borgia committed several notoriously cruel acts, like appointing a ruthless governor named Ramiro di Orco to pacify the Romagna region through harsh measures, and then, once order was restored, having Ramiro publicly executed, cut in half in the town square, to simultaneously appease the populace and demonstrate his own ultimate authority. Now, these are undeniably cruel actions, but Machiavelli argues that the result of Borgia's overall campaign, including these acts, was the establishment of order, peace, and good government in a region that had previously been plagued by chaos, petty tyrants, and constant warfare. So Machiavelli makes the controversial argument that Borgia's apparently malicious behavior was, in fact, merciful in the bigger picture, because by acting decisively and, yes, cruelly when necessary, he saved the people of the Romagna from the far worse, far more widespread suffering of perpetual political chaos and violence. This leads to that paradox of mercy we touched on. A prince like Scipio, who shows perhaps excessive mercy and allows indiscipline or unrest to flourish, is, in Machiavelli's view, not truly merciful, because that leniency ultimately harms everyone in the community. A limited number of severe, exemplary punishments affecting a few individuals, carried out swiftly and for clear reasons of state security, is actually better, more merciful in its consequences, than widespread disorder that harms the entire population.
Okay, so the cruelty has to serve the state, not the prince's ego. But you also mentioned avoiding hatred being key. How does that fit in?
That is the absolute key constraint, the non-negotiable boundary. While a prince should aim to be feared if he can't be loved, he must at all costs never allow that fear to curdle into hatred. Hatred for Machiavelli is fatal. It breeds conspiracies, fuels internal revolts, makes assassination attempts likely, and ultimately leads to the prince's overthrow. Fear keeps people obedient. Hatred makes them actively seek your destruction. So, how does a prince inspire fear without inciting hatred? Machiavelli gives very specific, pragmatic advice. Rule number one is do not unjustly harm your subjects or crucially confiscate their property without extreme justification. And he makes that incredibly cynical, but perhaps psychologically astute observation. Men forget more quickly the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony, their inheritance of property. Property rights, financial security interfering with those is a sure way to generate deep, lasting hatred. Rule number two, if punishment, even execution, is absolutely necessary for the security of the state, there must always be a clear and obvious cause and an adequate justification. It cannot seem arbitrary or purely self-serving. There needs to be a legal pretext, a demonstrable reason, something that people can, however reluctantly, understand as adhering to some form of process, even if harsh. Without that justification, fear quickly transforms into resentment and hatred, and that, Machiavelli insists, is the path to a prince's undoing.
So, bottom line then, love alone, as a primary basis for leadership, just isn't reliable enough to secure a prince's position, especially when times get tough or challenges arise.
Precisely. That's the inescapable conclusion from Machiavelli's perspective. He saw human nature as fundamentally self-interested and unreliable, especially when put under pressure. He explicitly uses the example of Girolamo Savonarola, that Dominican friar who became the charismatic de facto ruler of Florence in the late 15th century. Savonarola led a powerful moral revival, preached fiery sermons, and for a time was immensely popular, deeply loved and revered by his followers who hung on his every word and helped him effectively govern the city. However, as soon as his political fortunes began to wane, as soon as he faced serious opposition from the Pope and internal factions, he was completely abandoned by those same devoted followers. He lacked the means or perhaps the will to enforce his rule through anything other than moral persuasion and popular affection, and when those failed, he had nothing left. He was ultimately arrested, tortured, and executed in the very square where he had once held sway.
A stark example.
Very stark example. Machiavelli's lesson here is crystal clear. People are largely driven by self-interest. Love and popular affection provide support only when it benefits them, when the leader seems strong, successful, and is delivering positive outcomes. But when times get tough, when sacrifices are required, or when the prince's power appears to weaken, that affection can evaporate astonishingly quickly. Loyalty based on love is conditional and fragile. As Machiavelli pointed out, drawing on other historical figures like Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus, founders who used force. If they had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long. Savonarola, the unarmed prophet, as Machiavelli called him, was ruined as soon as the populace no longer believed in him, as soon as he faced real, forceful opposition, because he lacked both the arms and the willingness to employ fear and decisive action to maintain control. The fear of punishment, Machiavelli argues relentlessly, is a reliable constant, unlike the fickle and unreliable nature of human affection. Therefore, if you were to rank leaders by the stability of their power, the weakest are those who depend solely on love. Stronger leaders are those who inspire fear. And the strongest, most secure leaders are those rare individuals who somehow manage to inspire both fear and love, or at the very least they master the incredibly difficult art of inspiring necessary fear while meticulously avoiding that fatal threshold of hatred. The conclusion is unavoidable in his framework. A prince must act powerfully and decisively, even cruelly if the state's necessity demands it, but never, ever to the point where his actions incite the deep-seated, destructive hatred of his own people. That is the ultimate tightrope he must walk.
So we've taken a really deep dive today into The Prince, exploring Machiavelli's often stark, always intensely pragmatic advice on leadership, power, and the art of statecraft. We've seen how he just dissects the raw mechanics of power, everything from conquering new lands to managing loyalty and, yes, deploying force, not really as a moralist, but more like An unflinching political scientist, maybe?
Yeah,
It really forces you to question what we think we know about effective leadership, doesn't it?
it really does. We've navigated through Machiavelli's often deeply cynical realism, his core belief that leaders absolutely must understand the darker side of human nature, the selfishness, the fickleness, the capacity for betrayal, and more controversially, be willing to act outside the bounds of conventional morality when the survival and stability of the state seem to demand it. His insights, however brutal or uncomfortable they might be to grapple with, force us to confront some pretty hard truth about leadership that maybe we often prefer to ignore or idealize away. He makes us ask, when the chips are really down, what will a leader actually do? What must they do, perhaps, to preserve power and order?
Absolutely. And engaging with this material, even critically, definitely helps us understand the decisions, sometimes baffling or shocking decisions, of historical figures. And maybe it even gives us a lens to analyze modern politicians, corporate leaders, anyone in a position of significant power. It's a powerful, if unsettling, reminder that beneath the public facade, beneath the rhetoric, power often operates by a different, sometimes much harsher set of rules than we might wish. Rules dictated by pragmatism, by necessity, maybe, over purity or idealism.
But it also leaves us, and importantly, leaves you, our listener, with a really profound question to consider, doesn't it? If Machiavelli's primary overriding concern was the preservation and health of the state, and he was seemingly willing to accept almost any means necessary to achieve that end, what then are the acceptable limits for leadership in our own time? How do we, today, balance the undeniable need for effectiveness and stability in governance with the equally vital demands for ethics, human rights, and transparency, especially in our incredibly interconnected, information-saturated world? Is it truly always better to be feared than loved, as Machiavelli starkly concluded based on his time? Or has the fundamental calculus of power perhaps shifted in an age where information, and therefore public opinion, both domestic and global, can spread instantaneously? An age where maybe inciting hatred, even unintentionally, is far more dangerous and self-defeating for a leader than it might have been back in Machiavelli's tumultuous 16th century Italy. It's a question that continues to challenge leaders and citizens across every single domain.